She was left at the train station with a baby and no name, until the silent cowboy said, "You do now." A young woman abandoned at a train station with a baby and no name, and had an encounters with a silent cowboy in Dust Creek, Wyoming. Now let's dive into the story. The last whistle of the evening train echoed over the barren plains like a wounded cry. The rails shimmered faintly in the dying light, stretching endlessly into the frozen horizon. Dust Creek Station was little more than a clapboard shack with a flickering lantern and a rusted sign barely hanging from its post. The young woman stepped off the train with trembling hands, clutching a small, squirming bundle wrapped in a thin gray blanket. The baby stirred, fussing against the cold wind. Snowflakes drifted around them, silent, indifferent witnesses to her arrival. She stood there, unsure of what to do, her breath forming white ghosts in the air. The platform was empty except for a ranch hand unloading crates and the old station master watching from the doorway. The train hissed, steam curling up like smoke from a dying fire. The conductor paused before climbing back aboard. "You sure this is your stop, ma'am?" he asked, his voice kind but uncertain. Her lips trembled. I don't know." He frowned. "This here's the end of the line. Ain't nothin' past Dust Creek for 50 miles. She nodded, though her eyes darted about the desolate station. No one was waiting. No familiar face appeared from the shadows. Only the endless white and the whisper of the wind. When the conductor tipped his hat and boarded, she felt the ache of finality. The train roared to life, wheels clattering as it pulled away. She stood motionless, the sound of the engine fading into nothingness until the only noise was her baby's soft whimper. The baby, tiny and warm against her chest, was all she had left. Inside the station, the wood stove offered a weak heat. The telegraph operator, a balding man with spectacles too big for his nose, squinted at her through the dim light. "Ma'am, need your name for the record. Can't mark you in as a passenger otherwise." She froze. Her name. Her mind reached back through fog and fear, but all that came were fragments. Running footsteps, a dark coat, the smell of whiskey, a baby's cry in the night. I don't know," she whispered at last, lowering her eyes. The operator stared, confused. "Well, I can't rightly file, don't know. You got a husband or someone waitin' for you?" She shook her head, clutching the baby closer. "No one." He sighed. "Then you best take a seat. I'll see what I can do." She sank onto a wooden bench, the baby nestled against her heart. She stared out the frost-covered window, watching the last traces of the train's smoke fade into the distance. That's when she saw him. He stood just beyond the window, half shrouded by the falling snow, a tall, broad man in a long brown duster coat and a black hat pulled low over his face. A single horse stood tethered behind him, steam rising from its flanks. He didn't move, just watched. When she blinked, she thought he might disappear, like a mirage born from exhaustion. But he remained, silent as stone, the faintest wisp of breath leaving his lips in the cold. Something about him felt different, calm, grounded, but unreachable, as if the silence around him was his home. Later, when night crept in and the station master locked the door for the evening, she sat on the platform steps, rocking the baby. Her fingers were numb, her tears froze before they fell. The world felt cruelly wide and empty. Then she heard the crunch of boots in snow. The man approached slowly, his horse following behind. He stopped a few feet away, studying her. He didn't speak, didn't even remove his hat. But after a long moment, he knelt beside her and opened his saddlebag. From within, he pulled a folded wool blanket, worn but warm, and laid it gently over her baby. The gesture was so quiet, so deliberate, that it took her breath away. She looked up, startled. "You don't talk." He met her gaze for the first time. His eyes were the color of old whiskey, steady and deep, filled with something unreadable. He gave a single shake of his head. She swallowed, uncertain whether to fear him or thank him. Then, "Why help me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his gloved hand, gesturing toward the sky, the snow, then toward his heart. A wordless kindness. Promise, maybe. She watched him stand, tall and solemn against the moonlight. Then he turned and disappeared into the storm. The baby stirred again, cooing softly under the new blanket. She pressed her lips to its forehead and whispered, "Maybe we weren't left behind, little one. Maybe we were found." And for the first time since stepping off that train, she didn't feel completely alone. The next morning came gray and bitterly cold, the kind of Wyoming dawn that bit through wool and bone alike. Snow had fallen all night, burying the tracks, the platform, and nearly the little station itself. The wind sang through the gaps in the wooden walls like a ghost with nowhere to go. The young woman, still nameless to everyone but the baby she held, woke to the sound of rattling shutters. The telegraph operator had gone silent hours ago, leaving her and the infant curled beneath the station's bench, wrapped in the silent cowboy's blanket. Her lips were cracked from the cold. The baby's cheeks glowed pink, but its breath came soft and shallow. Outside the world was a white blur. Through the frost-clouded window she saw a figure moving slowly through the storm, a dark silhouette against the snow. It was him. The same silent cowboy from the night before. His horse trudged behind him, steam rising from its nostrils. He opened the station door without a word, snow gusting in behind him. The warmth that followed wasn't from the meager fire but from the steadiness of his presence. Storms worsened, the station master muttered from his desk. Ain't no trains comin', or goin' for days, maybe weeks. The cowboy nodded once, then looked toward the woman and her child. She felt his gaze, quiet but unshakable. When she met his eyes, something passed between them, recognition maybe, or a shared understanding of being stranded in more ways than one. You got a place to stay, ma'am? The station master asked. She shook her head. No, I don't. Before she could say more, the cowboy motioned with a tilt of his head toward the door. His gloved hand rose, pointing north along the ridgeline. A few miles that way lay a cluster of cabins, old homesteads scattered in the hills. The station master hesitated. If Cole's off errand, miss, you should go. Ain't no safer place in weather like this. Cole. The name fit him somehow, plain, sturdy, carved from silence. She stood, the baby clutched close, uncertain whether to trust a man she'd never heard speak. But when she saw the way he waited, patient, steady, not demanding, something in her heart shifted. All right, she whispered. He helped her onto his wagon, covering her and the baby with a heavy wool tarp. Snow lashed against her face as the horses pulled forward, their hooves sinking deep into the drifts. The ride was long and silent except for the creak of the wheels and the rhythmic snorts of the horses. At one point, the baby began to cry, the sound small against the roar of the storm. Cole turned briefly, his eyes soft with concern. He rummaged behind the seat and handed her a canteen of warm water, then gestured to the baby, urging her to drink and keep the child close. She nodded, grateful beyond words. Hours later, through the storm's white veil, the shape of a cabin appeared, a single lantern glowing in its window like a promise. Cole pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down, moving quickly to help her. He led her inside before she could protest. The warmth hit her first, the scent of pinewood smoke and the soft crackle of fire. The cabin was small but tidy, with handmade furniture and tools hanging neatly on the wall. Cole gestured toward the chair by the hearth. Sit, his eyes seemed to say. She sank into it, clutching the baby. He busied himself without a word, stoking the fire higher, hanging her damp shawl to dry, setting a kettle to boil. The silence between them was strange, not empty but full of quiet intention. When the kettle whistled, he poured her a tin cup of broth and handed it over. The steam rose between them. Thank you, she murmured. He only nodded. After a while, as the baby slept in her lap, she dared to ask, You really don't talk at all? He paused, his face unreadable. Then after a long moment he shook his head. She lowered her voice. Can you write? He reached for a piece of kindling and a coal from the fire. Kneeling on the dirt floor, he traced letters carefully into the soot. See? Cole, she read softly. That's your name. He looked up, and for the briefest instant, a smile flickered in his eyes. Later, when she laid the baby down on a folded quilt near the fire, Cole brought over a cradle, roughly built, clearly handmade but solid. She looked at it in awe. You made this. He nodded once as if it weren't worth mentioning. That night, as the storm howled outside and the firelight danced across the cabin walls, she lay awake listening to the baby's soft breathing. Cole sat by the window, rifle across his knees, keeping watch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She studied his profile, strong, quiet, marked by lines that spoke of both hardship and gentleness. The kind of man who didn't need to speak to be heard. Maybe, she whispered into the dark, we weren't left behind after all. Cole turned his head slightly as though he'd heard her. And though the storm raged, the cabin felt like the safest place she'd ever been. By the time the storm passed, the world outside had turned into a silent kingdom of white. The snow lay heavy on the roofs, bending the pines and covering the earth like a secret. The silence felt almost sacred, until the baby's morning cry rose up, small and hungry, breaking through it like the sound of life returning. The woman stirred from her makeshift bed near the fire, rubbing her eyes. She'd slept little, afraid the baby might catch cold or that she'd wake and find this place, this cabin, this man, had been only a dream. But the warmth was real, the smell of smoke and coffee was real, and so was the tall figure moving quietly about the room. Cole was already up, pulling on his coat. He opened the door just long enough to let in a gust of icy air and a shaft of sunlight. Then he nodded toward a pail near the hearth. Fresh water, melted snow, left for her before dawn. He didn't need words. Everything he did said what others never could. She fed the baby slowly, smiling at the tiny hands that reached for her face. "You're tougher than you look, aren't you?" she whispered. "Guess we both are." Cole returned after a while with firewood stacked in his arms. His gloves were stiff with frost, his face reddened by the cold. He stomped his boots clean at the door, then caught her gaze and gave a brief, reassuring nod, his version of good morning. When she tried to stand to help, he motioned for her to sit. She ignored him, of course. "I can work too," she said, gathering the courage to speak in this space where silence felt almost like prayer. He tilted his head as if amused, then handed her a bowl of oats and gestured toward the baby. "Eat first," his eyes seemed to say. That day they fell into a rhythm, quiet, efficient, and strangely natural. She washed dishes with melted snow, humming softly to herself while Cole mended tools at the table. The sound of her humming filled the cabin in a way that words could not, softening its edges. When she caught him glancing over now and then, she smiled shyly. "You're not used to company, are you?" He shook his head once, faintly smiling back. As the days went on, her fear began to fade. The baby grew stronger, sleeping longer, crying less. She started to feel the ache of something deeper, peace. But peace brought questions too. One evening, when the fire burned low and the baby slept in the cradle, she sat across from Cole, folding the blanket he had given her at the train station. "You ever gonna tell me who you really are?" she asked gently. He didn't move at first. Then after a moment he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook and a piece of charcoal. On one page, written in careful block letters, were a few words. "Cole Branson. Cattle hand. Don't talk, can't." Her eyes softened. "Can't?" she asked quietly. He nodded. Then pointed to his throat, where a thin white scar ran from jaw to collar. She hadn't noticed it before. Her breath caught in her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That must have been." He raised a hand gently, stopping her. Then wrote, "Don't be. Silence can be a mercy." She looked at the words, at him, and felt something stir, something like understanding. She turned the notebook back toward him. "What about me?" she asked softly. "You think silence would be a mercy for someone who can't even remember her name?" Cole hesitated, then wrote another line. "You'll know when you're ready." She smiled sadly. "That's easy for you to say." He looked up, eyes steady, then pointed to her, hand to heart, and slowly, with deliberate fingers, spelled out in the air, "Echo." Her breath trembled. "Hope." He nodded once. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. "That's beautiful." She touched the baby's tiny fingers, then whispered, "Do you think it fits?" Cole leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. Then he signed one more word, slow and sure. "Yes." From that moment on, the name stuck. She began calling herself Hope. At first, it felt strange on her tongue, like wearing borrowed clothes, but as the days turned into weeks, it began to fit. Hope cooked beside Cole, learned the rhythm of his silence, and spoke to him as if he could hear every thought in her head, and maybe he did. The baby, too, began to thrive under Cole's quiet care. He carved small wooden animals for the child, sanded smooth and painted with ash and berry dye. Each evening, the firelight danced across their faces as the three of them sat together. The man who could not speak, the woman who had no past, and the baby who had given them both a reason to begin again. Sometimes, when the wind howled outside, Hope would watch him from across the room, her heart full and uncertain. "I still don't know why you helped me," she said one night. Cole only looked up, meeting her gaze for a long, wordless moment. Then he pointed to the cradle. The baby. Then to her. And finally to his own heart. Hope didn't need translation. She reached for his hand and whispered, "Maybe you were the answer to my prayer, before I even thought to ask it." And though Cole didn't speak, the warmth in his eyes told her she was right. By the time winter loosened its grip on Dust Creek, the snow began to melt into soft rivers that laced the valley like silver veins. Mud replaced frost, the creek began to sing again, and smoke from Cole's chimney curled gently into a sky no longer gray but pale and hopeful. Hope could feel life stirring back into the land, and into herself. It had been weeks since she'd stepped off that train, lost and nameless. Now she woke every morning to the smell of coffee and pine smoke, to the quiet sound of coal splitting wood outside, to the steady heartbeat of a life she never expected to have. The baby, her reason to keep breathing, had grown plump and rosy-cheeked. Cole had built a tiny cradle fence beside her bed, carving the edges smooth so the child wouldn't catch a finger on splinters. It was beautiful in its simplicity, just like everything he did. Hope found herself watching him more often. His quiet movements, the way he worked with his hands, the calm way he faced every task. He never hurried, never wasted motion, and somehow always seemed to know what she needed before she spoke it. Once, when she dropped a pail outside and muttered a frustrated curse, he'd only looked up from repairing a harness and smiled, not mockingly but gently, as if to say, "It's all right to not be perfect." She laughed for the first time in months that day. When spring came fully, Cole began taking her and the baby outside more often. He hitched up the wagon and drove them down to the creek, where wildflowers had started to peek through the melting snow. Hope sat on a rock, watching the sunlight dance on the water while Cole fished in silence. "You don't need to talk to fill a day, do you?" she said, smiling. He shook his head lightly, reeling in the line. His expression was calm, but there was something deeper behind it, a peace she envied. Sometimes she wondered what silence sounded like inside his mind. Was it quiet and still, or did it thunder with thoughts unspoken? When the wind picked up and blew her hair across her face, Cole reached out without thinking, brushing a stray strand away. The touch was so gentle it startled her. Their eyes met for just a heartbeat longer than comfort allowed. She blushed and looked away, pretending to fuss with the baby's blanket. But that moment stayed with her long after the sun dipped behind the ridge. That night the three of them sat by the fire. Hope was sewing a tear in her sleeve while Cole whittled something at the table. The only sounds were the pop of burning logs and the faint cooing of the baby in the cradle. Hope spoke softly, mostly to herself. "You ever think maybe we were both left behind so we could find each other?" Cole's hand paused mid-carve. He didn't look up, but after a moment he reached for his small notebook. He wrote carefully, then turned it toward her. "Sometimes what's lost is what saves us." Her throat tightened as she read it. "You believe that?" He nodded. Then he handed her what he'd been carving, a small bird, delicate and smooth. Its wings were outstretched, ready to take flight. Hope held it close, eyes glistening in the firelight. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He smiled faintly, pointing to her heart, then to the bird, then to her again. She understood. Freedom begins inside. One night near the end of spring, a storm rolled in, a wild one that shook the cabin with thunder and howling wind. Hope awoke to the sound of Cole shouting without sound, trapped in a nightmare. His breath came ragged, his face pale in the lightning's flash. She reached for him, shaking his shoulder gently. "Cole, hey, it's all right. You're safe." He blinked awake, confused, sweat running down his temple. His chest heaved as he stared into the dark, gripping the sheets like a man fighting ghosts. "You were dreaming," she whispered. "It's gone now." He turned his face away, ashamed, but she didn't let him hide. She reached for his hand and held it tight between hers. "Whatever it was," she said softly, "it doesn't have you anymore." For the first time she saw tears in his eyes, silent, unfallen, but they're all the same. He looked at her then, eyes raw and open. Slowly he raised a hand, tracing letters shakily against her palm. "DJNKYOU." She pressed his hand against her cheek, closing her eyes. "You don't have to thank me," she whispered. "You already saved me a dozen times over." They sat like that for a long while, the storm raging outside, the firelight flickering low, two broken souls finding peace in each other's quiet. When morning came, the storm had passed. The baby gurgled happily from its cradle, sunlight spilling through the window. Cole poured her coffee without being asked, his movements calm, sure. Hope looked at him, at the scar on his throat, at the tenderness in his silence, and felt something deep and certain settle inside her chest. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was love. Quiet, steady, and stronger than any word could hold. By early May, Dust Creek was alive again. The last of the snow had melted, the creek ran swift and clear, and the scent of wet earth filled the air. Hope and Cole's cabin, once buried in white silence, now sat nestled in a valley of green and wildflowers. Every morning, Cole rose with the sun, tending to his small herd and repairing fences that the winter had broken. Hope fed the baby, now bright-eyed and laughing, and hung laundry on a line strung between two aspens. Their days moved in a quiet rhythm of chores, warmth, and the kind of peace born only from shared solitude. But peace, Hope had learned, was a fragile thing. It began with a sound, a distant echo of hooves on the old wagon road. At first she thought nothing of it. Travelers sometimes passed through on their way to the mines or the next town. But as the sound drew nearer, something deep inside her went cold. The rhythm of the hoofbeats was too deliberate, too heavy. Cole must have sensed it too. He stopped chopping wood mid-swing, his eyes narrowing toward the road. The air changed, the birds stopped singing, the wind fell still. A man appeared out of the dust. He was tall, dressed in a long black coat despite the warmth of spring. His face was handsome in a cruel, calculating way. When he saw Hope hanging laundry in the yard, he smiled, a thin, knowing smile that froze her where she stood. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, reining in his horse. "Didn't think I'd find you out here, Clara?" The name hit her like a blow. Claire. Her name. The one she'd buried deep, hoping never to hear again. The baby began to cry from the cabin doorway. Hope turned instinctively, shielding the child behind her body. Cole stepped forward, the axe still in his hand. His expression didn't change, but the air around him grew taut, dangerous. The stranger glanced at him, smirking. "And who might you be, friend? The new husband? Or just some ranch hand keeping the lady company while she hides what's not hers?" Cole didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was its own kind of threat. Hope swallowed hard. "What do you want?" she managed to say, her voice shaking. The man tilted his head. "Just what's mine. You, Claire. And that child." Hope's blood ran cold. Memories came flooding back, nights filled with shouting, with bruises, with the smell of whiskey and anger. The baby crying, her hands trembling as she boarded that train in the dark, knowing she'd never survive if she stayed. "She's not yours," she said fiercely. The man's smile vanished. "You gonna lie to me again?" He swung down from the horse, his boots crunching in the dirt. "You're coming back to me one way or another?" Cole stepped between them before she could move. The axe hung loosely at his side, but his posture spoke volumes. The stranger sneered. "You her protector now? You gonna fight me for another man's wife?" Cole's gaze didn't waver. He dropped the axe softly into the dirt and, with slow, deliberate motion, pulled his rifle from the porch rail. The barrel caught the sunlight like a flash of truth. The stranger froze. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then the man chuckled, low and mean. "You're a fool, cowboy. You think I won't?" Cole didn't lift the rifle. He didn't have to. His stillness was worse than violence. It said, "You take one more step and I end this." The man read it clearly in his eyes. His sneer faltered, pride giving way to unease. "You can't keep her forever," he spat. "You can't change what she did." Cole's jaw tightened. His finger brushed the trigger. The stranger's courage broke. With a curse, he swung himself back onto his horse. "This ain't over," he said, though his voice had lost its swagger. He turned and rode off down the road, dust trailing behind him. Hope stood frozen, the baby wailing in her arms. When the sound of hooves faded into nothing, she turned to Cole. Her whole body shook. "He knew my name," she whispered. "He knew everything." Cole set the rifle down and stepped toward her. She backed up, trembling, ashamed. "I ran," she said. "I ran away. I thought, if I got far enough he'd never find me. I didn't steal the baby. She's mine. She's mine, Cole, I swear." He stopped her panic with a touch, a light, steady hand on her shoulder. Then he looked her squarely in the eyes, calm as the earth. He didn't speak. But his silence said, "I believe you." Hope's tears came then, hot and heavy. "He won't stop, Cole," she whispered. "He'll come back." Cole knelt down beside her, took a stick from the dirt and wrote in the earth, "Not while I breathe." Her tears turned into sobs. She sank into his arms, clutching his coat as though he were the only thing keeping her upright, and maybe he was. That night, as the wind swept through the valley and the moon rose pale over the pines, Cole stood guard outside the cabin. He didn't sleep. Didn't need to. Inside, Hope watched him through the window, the baby sleeping in her arms. Her past had found her, but for the first time she wasn't running anymore. Because this time she wasn't alone. The next morning dawned gray and heavy with clouds. The air had the kind of stillness that followed a storm, even though none had come. Hope barely slept. Every creak of the cabin walls made her flinch, every distant coyote cry sent her heart racing. Cole hadn't come inside all night. When she stepped out at dawn, she found him sitting on a log near the barn, hat pulled low, rifle across his lap. His coat was dusted with dew. He looked as if he'd been carved from the earth itself, solid, unmoving, eternal. "Cole," she said softly. He turned his head slightly, just enough to show her he was listening. His eyes were tired but steady. "You didn't sleep." He gave the faintest shake of his head. She swallowed hard, guilt pressing against her chest. "I'm sorry. He shouldn't have come here. I thought we were safe." Cole's gaze drifted toward the hills where the stranger had disappeared. Then he looked back at her. There was no blame in his eyes, only quiet resolve. He lifted a hand, signed something small. "You're safe now." Her throat tightened. "He'll come back," she whispered. "Men like him don't stop." Cole looked away, then picked up a small piece of wood from the ground. He took out his knife and began carving, slow and precise. Hope stood there in silence, watching his hands move, each cut sharp and deliberate. The baby fussed in her arms. She rocked her gently, the sound of the knife against wood oddly comforting. After a while, Cole finished and handed her the carved piece. It was a small wooden heart, simple, a bit rough but made with care. On one side he'd carved a single word. "Stay." Hope's breath caught. She ran her fingers over the letters, her eyes stinging. "You mean it?" He nodded once. "But you barely know me," she said softly. "You don't even know what I've done or why I ran." He stood then, stepping close enough that she could see the faint scar across his jaw, the mark of some old wound. Slowly, he took the heart back from her, turned it over, and carved another word into the other side. Then he placed it gently into her palm. "Enough." She looked up at him, confused. He gestured toward her chest, then to the baby, then to himself. Finally he mouthed the words, slow, deliberate, each syllable like a vow. "You've done enough running." Hope's composure broke. She pressed the wooden heart against her lips, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You don't know what this means to me," she whispered. Cole's eyes softened. He reached up, brushing away one tear with his thumb, a simple, tender act that said more than any words could. For a long time they stood like that, two broken souls bound by quiet understanding. The wind stirred the grass, the baby gurgled softly between them, and somewhere far off, the creek whispered through the valley. Later that day, as the sky cleared, Cole led her down to the water. He carried a shovel and a small tin box. Hope followed, uncertain. When they reached the creek bed, he knelt and dug a small hole beside the willow tree. From his coat pocket he took out a folded scrap of paper, old, weathered. He handed it to her. It was a wanted notice, yellowed and torn. Her name, Clara Mayfield, was printed across the top. Below it, in smaller letters, "Wanted for desertion and theft." Hope's breath hitched. "How did you?" He didn't answer. He just looked at her with that steady, knowing gaze. "I didn't steal anything," she said, voice trembling. "He took everything from me, my money, my name, my dignity. When I ran, I took what was mine, and my baby." Cole nodded once. Then, without hesitation, he set the paper in the box, closed the lid, and buried it beneath the willow. As the dirt covered her past, something in Hope broke free. She knelt beside him, hands shaking, and whispered, "You buried my name." Cole met her eyes. Then, for the first time since she'd known him, he spoke. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but steady as the earth. "No," he said. "I gave you a new one." Her heart stopped. "A new one?" He nodded once. "Hope." Her lips parted. You called me that the day we met. I thought." He smiled faintly. "Seemed right." The baby cooed between them as if agreeing. Hope laughed through her tears, her heart aching in the best way. "Hope," she whispered, tasting the word like a promise. Cole's hand brushed hers again, his touch warm and grounding. No more running. No more fear. Only the quiet strength of a man who didn't need to speak to be understood. That night, as the stars spread across the Wyoming sky, Hope lay awake beside the sleeping baby. She could hear Cole outside, moving softly through the yard, checking the horses, tending the fire. Each sound was a reassurance, proof that she wasn't alone anymore. In the darkness, she held the little wooden heart in her hand, tracing the carved words over and over. "Stay." "Enough." And for the first time in her life she believed them. The morning began like any other, golden light spilling through the cabin window, the scent of coffee mingling with wood smoke, and the soft cooing of the baby in her cradle. Hope moved quietly around the small kitchen, her bare feet brushing against the worn wooden floor. Outside, she could hear Cole tending to the horses, the steady rhythm of his work grounding her in a way nothing else ever had. The cabin felt alive now. It had warmth, laughter, and the sound of tiny feet kicking against blankets. But beneath it all, there was a quiet tension, a knowing that peace could still be broken. The man from her past hadn't returned in weeks, but the memory of his sneer still haunted her dreams. Cole never said a word about it. He simply kept a rifle by the door and an eye on the horizon. That morning, when Hope stepped out to hang the wash, she saw something on the ridge, a flicker of movement too far to make out clearly. Her heart stuttered. By midday, a rider appeared on the trail. Cole was already waiting by the fence when the stranger came into view. The same black coat. The same cruel grin. Only this time he wasn't alone. 2 other men rode with him, both armed. Hope clutched the baby close and backed toward the cabin door. Cole turned slightly, meeting her eyes for just a second. That one look said it all. Inside. No. She obeyed, heart pounding. Through the window, she watched as the 3 men drew closer. Well, the leader sneered, dismounting. The silent cowboy himself. Didn't think you'd make this hard, friend? Cole didn't move, didn't blink. His rifle rested easy in his hands, pointed toward the dirt. The man spat in the dust. You've got something that belongs to me. The woman. And the brat. Cole's expression didn't change. He simply lifted the rifle, slow, deliberate, until it was level with the man's chest. Now hold on, the man said quickly, forcing a laugh. No need to get ugly. I'll take her peaceful like. Ain't no law out here says she's yours. From the cabin, Hope could barely breathe. She knew Cole's silence wasn't coldness, it was control. Stillness before the storm. The man smirked again. What's it gonna be, cowboy? You can't keep her. You don't even talk. Ain't got nothing to say for yourself? For the first time Cole spoke. Plenty. The sound of his voice was low, deep, and calm, a voice that carried weight. The men shifted, uneasy. She's mine now, Cole said evenly. Not like you think. She's free here. Safe here. You want her, you go through me. The man's grin twisted into a snarl. Then that's what I'll do. He reached for his gun, but Cole was faster. The shot cracked through the air, echoing off the canyon walls. Birds exploded from the trees. The leader dropped to his knees, clutching his shoulder, the pistol falling from his hand. The 2 others froze. Cole's rifle stayed steady. Pick him up, he ordered. They hesitated only a moment before dragging their wounded leader back onto his horse. You tell him, Cole said, voice like iron, if he ever comes near this valley again, he won't ride back out. The men didn't argue. Within seconds they were gone, hooves pounding down the trail until all that remained was the smell of gunpowder and the whisper of wind. Hope stumbled out of the cabin, baby in her arms, tears streaming down her face. Cole. He turned, lowering the rifle. His face was calm, but his hands shook just slightly as the adrenaline drained away. You could have been killed, she whispered. You. He stepped toward her, cupped her face in his rough, calloused hand, and brushed his thumb across her cheek. No more running, he said quietly. Hope broke then, into tears, into laughter, into something too full to name. She clung to him, the baby pressed between them, feeling his steady heartbeat against her own. They stood like that for a long time, the weight of fear finally falling away. Later that evening, the sky burned pink and gold over Dust Creek. Cole sat on the porch, whittling while Hope rocked the baby nearby. She'll need a name, Hope said softly, looking down at the little girl's sleeping face. Cole smiled faintly, his hands never stopping their quiet carving. You pick. Hope thought for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the valley, where wildflowers swayed in the fading light. Grace, she said finally. Because she's what I never thought I'd find again. Cole nodded. Grace, he repeated as if sealing it into the earth. When he handed her the carving a few minutes later, she found it wasn't a heart this time, but a small nameplate, 3 words etched into the smooth wood. Hope, Grace, and Cole. Her throat tightened. You put me first, she whispered. He looked at her then, long, steady, unflinching. Because you were lost the longest. Hope reached for his hand. Not anymore. The sun dipped behind the mountains, and for the first time since she stepped off that train, Hope didn't feel abandoned. She felt chosen. And though the silent cowboy said little after that, his every glance, every small touch, told her what she already knew. She had a name now. She had a home. She had a man who didn't need words to love her. And in the heart of Dust Creek, where wildflowers bloomed over buried pain, the story of Hope, Grace, and Cole began, quiet, steadfast, and eternal.